I've got Steve on the line. How are you doing, Steve?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Nice to see you, Will.
Great. Now, how's the weather in? Is it Oxford where you are
Yeah,
today?
in Oxfordshire, it's a bright, sunny day here today, which is great. Not that we can get out very much, but play the game.
Yes. It always amazes me that even in the midst of the apocalypse, the sun still shines.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, no, I'm all energized. We're starting each day with PE with Joe Wicks. I don't know if you come across that as a family. We're one of probably 500,000 families tuning in or something, doing half an hour of light exercise in the morning to get us going, which is great.
Well, for those self isolating, got to pass the time somehow. Get the exercise in. So that sounds great. So, Steve, you've had a really fascinating career, and you've got some amazing adventure tales that we're going to hear now. And there's some incredible parallels from some of the work you've been doing in leadership and in various polar and extreme environments that have immense parallels to the work that the NHS staff are doing on the front line during this pandemic.
I hope so. Let's find out.
So let's start off, Steve, by talking about isolation. It's such a hot topic at the moment, and you've had a lot of experience of isolation in the poles and polar regions. What what are your perspectives on isolation?
Isolation's a yeah, it's a funny thing because most people don't experience it until they're put in a position where usually without much choice. I'm comparatively lucky because I chose to go on my own once on an expedition to the Karakoram Mountains in Pakistan. I was due to go with a friend on a mountaineering expedition, but he hurt his back. But I got all the equipment, the time off, and everything planned. So I said, right, I'm just going to go and and see what it's like to be out in remote wilderness on your own for a few weeks. And I spent several weeks up on the Choctaw Glacier exploring on my own. And part of the thinking behind it was to see if I found myself good company and what it was like it was a training agenda to see if I wanted to go on a polar expedition on my own. The year before, I'd led a team of three other people across the Greenland ice cap, and thought this was trying to get to one of the poles was kind of the next step. And what I found was several things. One, it wasn't that I didn't find myself good company. I quickly learned that you've got to have a structure in the day. You've got to be disciplined to a certain extent to get jobs done. But there was no one to share the experience with. And one of the things I've enjoyed the most out of all the expeditioning that I've done, wherever it's been in jungle or mountains or poles, it doesn't really matter, is that shared experience with the people that you're with. And it's a really intense period of your life that you've spent usually a few months planning and training for, and then you go away for a few weeks, but the intensity of the experience lives with you, and the friendships, if they go well, will live with you for years and years afterwards. And I realized if you go on your own, you're missing that. And I found it wasn't that I was lonely. I was busy, looking after myself in the mountains. Risk management changes completely. Every time I crossed a crevasse on my own, I thought, well, if I slip and fall in here, I'll have just disappeared. No one will ever find me. Will be no. If a search party came, the chance of finding me were nil. So your risk management becomes much more cautious. And that and after that, I chose to go on expeditions with friends, or sometimes I was working and guiding people I didn't know. And I'd really contrast that experience with working on an isolated base in Antarctica, where you've got a group of people, but you can't actually go out. You can't leave. You're stuck in the place because of in Antarctica, the natural hazards outside. Our main base in Antarctica, a place called Union Glacier, is on an active glacier with crevassing. So we have a safe camp zone, and we have designated safe routes into the area. But you can't just wander off when you're fed up with your work colleagues, and if you're ever fed up with your work colleagues, I should say, you can't go out. So you're stuck in a very what can be a high pressure environment, because particularly there as well, there's no going home. You're working long hours, and then your home is the base as well. So the dynamics of a normal work life environment and having somewhere to go are changed completely, and that impacts on people. And we are lucky enough working in Antarctica to be able to recruit people who thrive and love that environment. But every now and again we'll have somebody who for whom it's a psychological disaster, and they're stressed in ways that they couldn't imagine that they would be before they got there, and it just doesn't work for everybody. And I think that's one of the themes of what's going on at the moment. You've got people working with great intensity for perhaps even longer than normal, and your colleagues' stress responses are unpredictable. And some people will be thriving and rising to the challenge, and other people will be kind of giving up and really not coping with how they're finding it.
Mm-hmm. And so you spent a lot of time in very close-knit teams in the Antarctic base, overwintering, I think. Is that right?
I've done about 10 Antarctic summers.
10 Antarctic summers. That's how long are each of those?
I've done 9. Did 9 in a row.
Wow. Yeah. So how long would you be in the base for?
For between 3 and 4 months.
3 to 4 months. And how big was the team that you were with?
It grew over those seasons. We started off with probably less than 20 people, and ended up with more than 50 colleagues and aircrew. So it became quite a big.
And you were presumably living in quite close confinement during that time, were you?
Yes, we were. Our bedrooms are actually tents, so we'd each have our own small mountain tent as our bedroom. So you had visual privacy, and on a windy night you wouldn't hear things, but other times the people who snored, you'd know who they were, and they would cause ructions in the team dynamics. You'd have to get them to move to a remoter location, or down the downwind end of camp, and was not that much personal space, and some people struggle with that.
Was there any characteristics of the people that you noticed struggled the most? Is there a certain type of person that you found that kind of environment particularly challenging, that didn't thrive as you might expect as other people did?
I think it's very difficult to predict. Some people bring their own behavioural problems, which don't solve things. I think of we've had 1 or 2 people who drink too much, and alcohol in moderation. It can be great to have a party, or a small celebration, drink with your mates after work. That can be fantastic. But if you're an individual who's really struggling with perhaps life at home, or relationships at home, or whatever it is, and you've come to Antarctica just thinking that will be a fresh start or to escape, it isn't. And all of those problems that you're running away from are probably still with you, and are actually compounded by the environment that you're in, with no release. So whether you're going to work at a base in Antarctica, or go on an expedition, or go to do some very intensive work in a hospital at the moment, I think one of the keys to success is getting your life at home sorted out. We'd pay our bills, make sure our relationship is secure, or and happy to be able to go away for weeks and months at a time, and then know that when you're there you can focus and live in the moment, and work and live as best you can with the people you're with, knowing that things are okay at home. If things are not okay, then I think that adds a whole level of stress, because you're not in a position, you can't do anything about it. It's just a worry and a nightmare.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Steve. Yeah, it sounds like you've witnessed some quite dysfunctional coping strategies to the stress of being in that environment. You mentioned some people drinking too much. Are there any other kind of behaviours that you've observed that have been really detrimental to life on the base and for the rest of the team members?
Yeah, I think the other obvious thing is about ego and the size of your personality. And I love this phrase about about being conscious of your emotional wake, when your impact with other people in close knit team or in a restricted environment like a ship or a base or a hospital ward, your impact on other people leaves an emotional wake. And if you're conscious and thoughtful about what that is, you'll be much more mindful of not having a negative impact on the people around you. So when you're frightened or scared or having a bad day or just hungry and cold or whatever it is, if you're aware that you can have a big negative impact on team morale, then you probably check yourself and think about and modify your behavior beforehand. And that's one of the key things that you need to be successful in that environment, is to be able to exercise some self-control, particularly in front of other people. And if you're in a position of responsibility or management or leadership, obviously that becomes even more important, because you're setting a tone for the morale in your workplace. And one person who's fed up, who wants to go home, who's not coping, who's stressed, they can be a cancer throughout the whole of the team morale. And one of the things I've experienced quite a lot as a manager in that environment is when you're aware that there's conflict between people, it's often very hard to work out who the cause is. Who, if you've got somebody perhaps is effectively bullying somebody else, it's very difficult. You can be aware that you've got two people effectively with some sort of psychological conflict going on, but it can be very hard to work out what the cause is, and then only when you've done that can you then work out what to do. And sometimes it's removing that person from the team, and everybody else breathes a huge sigh of relief and says, "Oh, thank goodness for that." And other times it would be just chatting to that person and having a hard conversation with them about their behaviour, and probably trying to find out what's going wrong for them and giving them some support so that they can raise their game and not have such a negative impact on others.
Yeah, I think that concept of emotional weight really resonates with me, Steve, and my experience of working in newly formed close knit teams in confined environments. It's always fascinated me just how small actions can be suddenly take on quite big significance, and that sense of injustice and the politics can really erupt out of nothing, really. And I think for leaders in those environments, managing the different personalities within that team and trying to be manage that situation in a way that is deemed as fair by all parties in a reasonable, proportionate way. That's such a huge challenge, isn't it?
And one of the things I find very, very interesting is when we're putting together teams of people to live and work together to run a base and operation in Antarctica, you're bringing people together who, in their own teams, have got a hierarchy. And each year we reopen the base. Our base doesn't operate all year round, so we've got a staff training period at the beginning of the Antarctic season. And effectively, it feels like starting a new business, in terms of you're rebuilding a team. You've got new people, you've got returning people, and the dynamics between the new people and the returning people is different. Some people might feel a bit threatened by some of the new guys. And so taking time to look after the team, find out about the individuals in it, and somehow in a really task-orientated, work-focused environment, make everybody feel that you've got time for them and to listen to them and know that you care about them is absolutely vital. And the more pressure there is on getting the work done, the easier it is to pretend that you don't need to do that. But you.
And what do you think should be the priority, Steve? Do you think you should be prioritizing the individuals within that team, the team itself, or the task that team is, the objective they're trying to achieve? What do you think?
Well, my perspective from working in extreme environments is you're job as an individual, whatever your role is to you've got to look after yourself. You're working in an environment that will do you harm, and if you're passive in the environment, you'll get injured and be harmed, and then you're taken out of, you can't work, and you become a patient or a casualty, and you need care. And so one of the things we emphasize in staff training at the beginning of the season is, however important the task is, you've got to look after yourself within it. And we all make mistakes. I've gone out on and left the base to go up to the runway or something, and had inadequate clothing on. I've left my big mitts behind by mistake, and it's much colder than I thought it was going to be. And so our advice is there. You've got to stop. You've got to look after yourself. You've got to avoid getting injured in order to be able to be effective tomorrow. And if you're on a skiing expedition to try and ski to the South Pole, you can't burn yourself out at the end of the first week. It's got to be sustainable. You've got to get enough food in. You've got to get enough sleep. You need to not get cold injury on your fingers or your nose. Otherwise, a minor thing becomes an expedition-ending injury very quickly. And so we say stop, check everything, look after each other, check each other's faces, and do a lot of as much support as you can with each other. But ultimately, if you realize you've got something wrong, and typically it might be just not having enough clothes on for the weather's deteriorated, and that means that the task is delayed by a bit because you've got to return to pick up some more things. You've got to go inside and warm up. Go inside and warm up, because if your fingers get irredeemably cold and you get frostbite, you won't be any use, not just tomorrow, but for the next few months as well. So as a manager, you're trying to make sure that people are task orientated and fit for work by supporting them to look after themselves, and to encourage them to have enough self-confidence to say, I put your hand up and say, I'm sorry, I've made a mistake, I've got this wrong, I need to stop, I need to go in, and I need to warm up, or I need to take a break, or I just haven't had enough sleep, I need to take tomorrow morning off. That's all fine. People, all we want is that matched by good communications with your colleagues around you. So if you've been up working all night and the other people don't know, they don't think you're just having a lie and being lazy, because you've left a message. You've told them, the last aircraft didn't land until 4 a.m. I've been up all night. I'll see you at lunchtime tomorrow.
So you created a culture where the individual team members, they are aware of what their own needs are, and when their own needs aren't being met, and are able to vocalize that amongst that team, so that can be addressed.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And it's interesting in the Antarctic, the Arctic, the polar regions, where your PPE, equivalent of personal protective equipment, is insulation. So you've got to be having the gloves, the right down, etc. On the front line in healthcare at the moment, our PPE is face masks, aprons, etc. And it's really interesting you saying about how you've got to make sure that your own welfare is safeguarded so that you can perform. The parallel for me would be yesterday when I was in practice. I'm a GP, and we had an emergency in a room, and I went to assist, and it's so easy to dive in there and just get stuck in. But it was a potentially COVID positive patient, and I needed to stop and take a time to put my own PPE on before I got stuck in, and it took an extra step for me to do that. But I think it's so important, because if we don't, then we get COVID. That's me out for 2 weeks, and potentially I infect other people, other patients. It's just a self-defeating event.
Yeah, the time frame is kind of, I guess, is similar. You're taking yourself out for weeks, and if you get it badly, the recovery seems to be more than a couple of weeks. So
yeah, absolutely. You've as well as being working out in Antarctica, you've been involved in a number of quite dramatic mountain rescues, I understand, Steve. I understand there was a time in the late 1980s when you were out running on Snowdon and something happened.
Yes, That's right. I was actually up in Snowdonia with a group of friends who we were getting fit and planning to go on a mountaineering expedition to the Karakoram Mountains that summer. It was late February. There was snow on the mountains, and I went for a run from Llanberis up the Llanberis path, which is the easy path up Snowdon. And my plan was to go up to the top and then descend a little bit and then go down the pig track and finish at our accommodation in Capel Curig. And it all went well. There was some snow, I was running in tracksuit bottoms and running shoes and had a fleece, and I had no ice sacks or boots or crampons or anything which you really needed for the summit section. And so I'd been to the top and had come back down a little bit, and there's a big standing stone that marks the top of a really steep section of zigzags down onto easier ground, where I knew if I could get down the first couple of zigzags, I would be fine. And I was standing there doing, I guess, a sort of what would now be called a dynamic risk assessment, which was, in essence, if I slip at the top, I'm going to shoot straight down this snowfield and over a cliff out of sight. And that didn't seem to be very, very sensible. So I was weighing up whether I wanted to run back to Llanberis and then how many miles that was going to add to my outing, or whether there was anything I could do to get down the zigzags. And a walking party arrived, wearing country clothing, walking boots, no ice axes, and I think there were 5 or 6 of them. And a gentleman, and the first 5 slid a little bit and did a left turn onto the first zig and were fine. And a gentleman at the back slipped at the top and slipped onto his back, and to my horror just slid without really doing anything on his back down this snowfield towards a drop. And I shouted at him to kick or use your stick or do something, try and respect, but he was I'm just sort of frozen in not knowing how to respond. And then he disappeared over the edge and was out of sight, and I didn't know how far he'd gone. And I was standing there feeling completely ill-equipped because I didn't have boots, didn't have an ice axe, had no rope. But I'd seen what had happened, and most people in the area were climbers around or other walkers around, hadn't actually witnessed what had happened. So I thought, I've got a key role to play here, and just looked around and just started shouting, because that was what I need to do to get attention, to a group of climbers over there, a group of walkers over there. And then 2 or 3 of the people from that walking party came back up, and I recognised the woman, who was a middle-aged woman, and I recognised her and said, "You're Jennifer Guinness, aren't you? Was that your husband who'd fallen?" And she said, "Yes." "He's dead, isn't he?" And I said, "Well, we don't know yet." But I recognised her because she had been kidnapped by the IRA 2 years before and had been held for, I think, about 8 days before she was released. She was kidnapped from her home in Dublin, and her husband had been attacked and hit in the face by a gun when she'd been kidnapped. And so I recognised her face from the news, and that changed. It was another layer of complexity. So I had to then grab some more people and say, "Please, I don't know what you're doing. Please, can you accompany this lady and her son and walk them back to the police station in Llanberis? It's that way. Basically, you have to find it." And I got some climbers and asked them to use their ropes to go down the snowfield and see what they could do to help. And I thought, well, this is pre many people having mobile phones. I need to call for help. So I thought, right, I will start running back down the way I came, and said to everybody there, right, well, let's meet up at the police station in Llanberis later, which seemed to be a sensible place to rendezvous. I looked these people in the eye who were going to accompany Mrs. Guinness down and said, "Don't let me down. Meet me at the police station and don't leave them and take them all the way there." And unfortunately, he had died. Her husband had fallen to his death, and he had a fractured skull and had gone quite, I think, about 500 feet in the end. And it was really a profound experience for me. And at the end, and what happened next was then meeting Mrs. Guinness and her son again at the police station a bit later on, and realizing that her priorities were, I've been in the press, I'm a public figure, I need to get home, I've got 2 daughters at home, I want to get home before the media arrive on my doorstep, which was another layer of complexity. But it was an example for me of situational leadership. I happened to be the person who had seen what had happened and could easily have just not done anything, I suppose, and waited for them to sort themselves out. But I thought, no, this is they were dressed as country walking gear, not in mountaineering gear. They were out of their depth in what was then an extreme environment for them, and I knew what needed to be done, and just found it was amazing. People really did respond, and came to my aid and to the walking group's aid, and it was from that aspect of it was really positive.
So clearly, that was a situation that was completely you were unprepared for, that you stumbled upon. My experience of those situations is there's often there's a void of leadership. There's somebody has to step into that void and start to make decisions and move things forwards. And it's amazing that you were able to do that so effectively.
Because what we do now in training is if you're on the site, or you witness a fire breaking out, or there's some sort of incident, you're in charge until somebody else arrives to take over. Your job is to report it, look after people, exercise first aid, be the first responder, but you're not. You don't become the incident commander as and when resources arrive. And what was unusual about that was until an RAF mountain rescue helicopter arrived sometime later, there wasn't anybody else arriving to take charge.
So you did that, yeah. It resonates with experience I had in the Pyrenees a couple of summers ago when I was doing medical cover for a commercial hut-to-hut trek, and one of the participants wasn't really paying attention, and she misplaced her pole during one of these winding mountain passes and just fell off an edge, which is she just went down. Luckily she kind of slid down like a cat, and finished about 40 feet below. And I was at the back of this group, and the people just shouting. They were just medic, and so I kind of rushed to the front to see what was going on. There was a couple of mountain leaders there as well, and they were already helping to assist and things. But it's amazing how you have to kind of suddenly switch into another gear. You're not ready for it.
And yeah, the nature of incidents. You might have trained for it. You might have thought about what you're going to do in that situation. But that was for me, that was a profound experience, I guess, in my life, because it was completely unprepared, and yet I had enough confidence and enough prior leadership experience in other environments, to particularly in youth organizations, to be able to think, oh, this is me, I need to do this.
So all of those experiences you felt have prepared you for this moment, that you were ready to step in and take the lead and help that poor individual. And of course you went on to, that was your training, one of your training runs for your Mount Vinson summit, is that right?
Well, that was training for to go to the Karakoram, but then that led on to me having enough experience to go on down to Antarctica, where things go wrong sometimes.
And they did, didn't they? They went very wrong in 1996 on Mount Vinson. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yes, that's right. So I was then the base camp manager at Mount Vinson, and Vinson's the highest mountain in Antarctica. It's one of the remotest regularly climbed mountains in the world, and there's no overland access. Well, there is, but it would take you weeks to get there. So most people fly in ski-equipped aircraft from ALE, or Antarctic Logistics main base, which was then about 100 miles away. And I was there to coordinate the communication between different guided groups and different expeditions on the mountain, to report weather, and to be the point of contact by radio or satellite phone back to the main base, and to be an honest broker of weather reporting to see whether it was safe to fly when people needed to come in or go out. And We had this terrible storm high up on the mountain, and very strong winds, very low temperatures, and there were multiple international guided groups up on the mountain who were all giving up. They were either coming down if they'd reached the summit the day before, or they were giving up because they couldn't stay in that storm and needed to get lower to safety. And with some other people at a lower camp. And early that evening, after hours of monitoring VHF radio traffic of people packing up and beginning to descend, I had a rough picture of where most groups were on the mountain, but not everyone. The satellite phone started ringing, and there was an English voice on the other end of the phone. Didn't say who they were, didn't say which group they were from, didn't say where they were, didn't say what the problem was, just said, "We're coming down the head wall." And then the phone dropped, the call dropped, and that was all I got. But I knew I got a British-speaking voice at the end of the phone, and we had New Zealand groups, we had American groups on the mountain, so I kind of knew which group it was. And 20 minutes later, the phone rang again, and I had another voice that I didn't recognise, of a different accent, and it just said, "We need immediate backup." And that was all I got. Didn't say who they were, where they were, what the problem was, how many of them there were, what aid they needed, or anything useful. And I thought, well, "We need immediate backup." That sounds like some line he'd heard from, some police TV show.
Yes, like Mayday, Mayday.
Yes. Okay. And on the basis of those two half sentences, we launched what turned into being a multi-day rescue to try and bring back 5 people who were then pinned down in this storm. And as ever, it's not just one thing that goes wrong, it's multiple things going wrong. So this group, they had a guide, they were very, very well led, they had a very good quality guide. He hadn't been on the mountain before. He was the last to leave the camp. The other groups who could have given him mutual support had left before him. They out of sight lower down on the mountain. Their radio batteries were flat. They were at their limits keeping their group safe, and in descent they couldn't really go back up to help. And in the storm, with hoods up and goggles on, this group had one of them had missed a zigzag around a crevasse and walked onto a crevasse bridge and fallen down inside it, fallen upside down, and lost one of his mitts. The guy did a great job, got him out, did a really good crevasse rescue. Took about 20 minutes, given the circumstances of probably -40 temperatures and strong winds. It was pretty good. In that time, one of the weakest members of his group was in a state of semi-collapse with hypothermia. So and the man who got out of the crevasse had badly frostbitten hands, both hands. He thought, right, okay, well, I'm going to take shelter here, call for some help, and that will be resolved fairly quickly. People should be able to come to my aid fairly quickly because they're not very far ahead of me. And they started digging a hole and actually found that they were on another crevasse bridge, and they dug a hole until that terrible thing where the hole appears beneath you. And that happened twice. And at which point they really thought, well, we're in a minefield here of crevassing in this terrible storm. We just need to hunker down and wait for some help to arrive. The trouble was there wasn't really any help to come. And so down at base camp, where actually it was in a lull out of the storm, I went round, who was in camp, did some negotiating to look after some guided clients on the basis that it would free up the guides and they'd be able to go. And I had 2 colleagues, so two ALE colleagues. So we ended up with 3 pairs as semi-independent rescue team who I briefed in our little comms tent, told them what the story was, what we knew, and in fact radio communications should improve as they got higher up on the mountain. And these people were really putting their own, with 2 Swedish climbers, 2 guides from New Zealand guiding company, and my 2 colleagues, and they didn't all know each other, but they all on the same, we fed them, gave them some food, gave them some fresh radio batteries, and off they went. And they were really putting themselves out in harm's way. They were being knocked to the ground, repeatedly trying to ski or up glacier. Wind speeds were incredibly strong, really hurricane force winds coming down off these big cliffs, and they couldn't get up to this team. And about 20 hours passed of increasingly distressed radio and satellite phone call messages, with people descending into hypothermia. They had very little shelter. It was a desperate situation where we thought we were heading towards having multiple fatalities. And very luckily, there was just a slight lull in the storm, just long enough for two guys who were at the front to get up, find them, and show them the way down to safety. And once they got over, the crevasse area they were in wasn't that big. And after they got over the lip of this slope and down, gravity came to their aid, and they managed to get back down to the low camp, where they weren't yet out of the woods. People were desperately trying to keep their tents together in this big storm, but everybody was rescued and brought back down a couple of days later to comparative safety of base camp, where we were able to assess the injuries. And there was one man who had fallen into the crevasse had obviously badly frostbitten fingers and thumbs on both hands, but we had no doctor at base camp then, and we had unflyable weather. The storm was raging, and so it was a great example of telemedicine and advice from my medical colleagues at our main base who told me what to do. And in fact, the patient was himself an ophthalmic surgeon, so he knew quite a lot, and was really helpful as well, and was incredibly stoical through what is an intensely painful experience of rewarming frostbitten digits. If you ever have to do it, you give them the strongest painkillers you can before you start, as it's hideously painful.
I mean, that's remarkable, given the number of climbers you had out on the mountain in extreme conditions and the predicament they were in that kind of minefield of crevasses. It's remarkable that the only injury sustained was some frostbite, and there's no loss of life.
Yes, we were. That was a level of stress on me and everybody else who was involved. Was it did look as if we may not everybody would survive, and particularly if we couldn't get to them. But in fact, they were in slightly better position than we thought. They had slightly more shelter. They'd pulled a tent over them. And modern mountaineering boots are so good. Their feet were at least safe inside their boots, despite the incredibly low temperatures and blistering wind speeds. It was been a hideous, and it was a very frightening experience for them. But we came through, and it was a great example of a team being pulled together at the last minute, given minimum resources but good communications and a drive to succeed and a will to save life. And my colleagues who and all six people who went out on that rescue team really put themselves in harm's way and really put themselves at risk in order to try to go to the aid of others, which which is worth remembering.
Absolutely. So that commitment to the team, that the self-sacrifice that the whole team made for the good of others, that's incredible. And your role in this, so you were coordinating this rescue response from base camp. You were in comms, presumably, with various different climbers who are out in this storm. And what was it like trying to coordinate that and communicate with the wind howling and everything kind of going south on you?
I think I had about 15 minutes of sleep in about 3 days, and I had to log everything. I was reporting back to our main base, who were reporting back to the rest of the world about what was coming, and no help could arrive. We couldn't fly in any help. We couldn't fly in any more guides or rescue team or doctors or anything until it was all over. It was several days later that we could, the storm abated. And in the meantime, I was running around trying to look after the guided clients whose guides had left them in my care and make sure they were fed and looked after. And was a great pulling together of team, of team from different supporters from different guide companies and organisations to really work together. And there was this sense of mutual support based on the fact that if it had happened to them, the same thing would have happened. Everybody else would have stopped what they were doing, put their own climb cancel their own climb and just gone to the aid of the people who needed it, and it was great.
The politics of these private companies that are taking clients is they are often in competition with one another. It's a commercial operation after all, and that's really interesting how they were able to put perhaps some of those politics aside and just club together and just get that rescue done. And it's amazing how that is a leveler, how adversity like that really forces people to just join together for that common cause.
Yes, and the two Swedish climbers were an independent pair who were climbing and skiing the seven summits, Martin and Olaf, and they'd done a massive day on the mountains, in the mountain, and skied back down in deteriorating weather. And I remember them just asking, do you mind if we have a bite to eat before we go out again? And there was no question of them not being fit and able to go and wanting to go and help. Although they weren't part of the guide company mutual sort of support network at all. They were two independent guys, but they were brilliant, and I'm remain very grateful to them. They did a fantastic job.
Wow, that's quite an incredible story. So Steve, you were also in Antarctica the year before that, 1995, on Mount Eppley. Is that right?
Well, I wasn't on Mount Eppley. I was at our main base at Patriot Hills when, similarly, we got a slightly mangled partial message, but definitely calling for help from a two-man team who were climbing, unusually not on Mount Vincent, but on the next couple of mountains along the range, Mount Shin and Mount Eppley and Mount Gardner. And one of them had fallen and was badly hurt with multiple fractures, and was somewhere several thousand feet up steep mountainside. And call came in. The position information didn't seem to quite work when we plotted it onto a map. But I was called to our operations, what was then a tent. We had two medics, a doctor and a nurse. The doctor said, "Right, my job is to stay here. Your job as a nurse is to go, if you're willing to." He was Ben Cooper, who's another member of the WEM faculty, and a member of Edale Mountain Rescue Team at home. So we looked at each other and thought, okay, yep, we're willing to say yes, we're willing to go. And the weather was appalling. The Patriot Hills Mountains, which give their name to where our base then was, were a couple of kilometres away from the camp, and you couldn't see them. And the Twin Otter captain, who was a very experienced veteran pilot, said, "Yeah, we've got enough visibility to go." And Ben and we loaded up our rescue gear, climbing gear, and took one other member of staff along as a safety person to look after the air crew when we landed. And we flew through cloud. Sitting in the back of the plane, Ben and I couldn't see anything for the first 40 minutes out of a sort of 50-minute flight. And and obviously the captain could see something, but we couldn't see anything out the back. And we were looking at each other fairly nervously about what we were going to go and do. And we couldn't land. We couldn't. The glacier was covered in cloud, and we had to return to base. So a whole 24 hours elapsed between the accident, guy breaking his leg, and us going again for a second attempt at landing. And we landed. It was extremely cold. It was early in the morning. It was about -40 still air temperature and in shadow at the base of these big mountains. And to our great relief, the one able-bodied climber who wasn't injured had done an amazing job of lowering for, I think, several thousand feet the guy who was injured, and got him to comparative safety at the bottom of the mountain. Done a great job of splinting his leg and giving him analgesia, and got him into this tiny tent. But there was no room inside for the uninjured climber as well. So he spent the whole night walking around outside, walking around in circles, what was left of the, it doesn't get dark, but it's extremely cold.
Just trying to stay warm, presumably.
And trying to keep the blood flowing until we arrived. And we got a box splint out, and it just shattered in the cold. It was just disintegrated. I thought, okay, well, we won't do any of that. And we put him onto a rescue sled, skied him back down to our Twin Otter aircraft. And when we got back to the aircraft, we got a radio message in from our main base saying that the weather had deteriorated there. We wouldn't be able to get in to Patriot Hills. So we had to divert to Mount Vinson Base Camp, which was only a very short hop away. And we had to spend a whole day there. And so it was, another 24 hours has elapsed after injury before we could get the patient back to our main base and at least stabilize him and plaster lower leg fractures there. And it was another few days before we got him into definitive care back in Chile. So you've got sometimes you've got quite extended time frames. It can take a lot longer than you would think. And we learned a lot from that experience. At Vinson Base Camp, the little tent door wasn't wide enough to carry a stretcher in. So we had to tip him on his side and shove him in sideways on a vac mat and stretcher. And after that, we said, well, that's not acceptable. So we ordered much wider doors and could change the physical infrastructure of the base to be able to cater for stretcher cases, which we hadn't had to do before. So it was always learning, and it's really good to be in a responsive organisation that's willing to respond and learn and evaluate at the end of these incidents and trying to work out what we can do better next.
So yeah, you had a number of setbacks and delays there. You missed your weather window, your kit didn't perform as you'd hoped, and you had to think on the hoof. You had to just adjust, you had to adapt, improvise and overcome. That's really amazing how you did that.
And the biggest thing at the start was it was a very, very intimidating situation to fly into, thinking that two moderately capable climbers were going to go to the rescue of two very, very able climbers, and we might have to climb several thousand feet or 1,000 feet up some pretty steep terrain, and then improvise some lowering rescue, on the hoof in extreme temperatures, on a shadowed face in Antarctica, a long, long way from help. And it was it was a psychological journey more than anything else to start with, until it all came good in the end, because the able-bodied climber had done such an amazing job of lowering his injured mate down to the bottom, and so we had a very easy and straightforward basically pickup that was made much more difficult by the weather and the lack of flying conditions. But it was the thought and being willing to think, this person's in trouble, we need to go and do what we, even if it's beyond our limit of our abilities, probably, frankly, we were willing to give it a go, and had this sort of bond of friendship which grew out of that. There
must have been a moment though where you and Ben felt afraid, where you considered your own welfare and you thought, well, am I up for this? Do I really want to put myself in that kind of risk? How did you kind of deal with that?
Well, we were asked whether we were willing to go, whether we were happy to be volunteered. We were the people who were on site. We were obviously the people who needed to go. We were in limited personnel resources there in the base at the time. We were the best people to go. So we both made independent decisions that we would, and I implicitly trusted the pilots. We had the pilot Paul was one of the world's most experienced Twin Otter bush pilots and polar pilots. So I was very comfortable flying in extreme conditions with somebody who is easy to put your trust in. But if we'd had novice pilots, then the situation would have been, well, the time frame for the delay would have been even more extended, because we'd have had to wait for better weather before being able to go. And it was and it was a great example of people who, from different spheres of work, coming together to form a new team to go and do something special, because other people other people were hurt and were calling for help.
Yeah, I sense there's an incredible sense of duty that you and Ben felt towards the other two teammates, um, and you felt that there was, if you weren't going to do this, then if not you, then who?
Exactly.
And I think that's the case for a lot of medics at the moment who are dealing with COVID patients. I think there is that sense of duty there, and that this is, whilst it is quite a terrifying time, there's also, we are it. We are the response to this, and if we don't step up right now, then no one else is going to be there to do it. It's on us.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I'm sure a lot of people are feeling that at the moment.
But that must also be a very powerful feeling when you know that you can really change that. You can turn the situation around. You can bring all that experience and training that you've done over the years. You can really bring that into and do something amazing with it.
Yes. So that experience of being the guide out on rescue missions gave me the experience to get promoted and become the operations manager or field operations manager in charge of the whole base in Antarctica, which I did for the next six years after that. And my incidents continue to happen. People would get ill in remote places, things would go wrong, and having been out on rescues was a really good experience, because I knew what it felt like to be asked to go and do something. But equally, the management of deploying your resources and trying to work out how much to use, when, how to communicate with people, how to plan, how to get people together, was built on all of the stories we've been speaking about today. And the whether it's first aid training or complex emergency response in Antarctica, the concept about doing the basics well is so important. And to assume that you remember that people don't know what you're thinking. You've got to stop and gather the people around you, share your plan, consult with them. I remember having a group of people where we had a rescue underway. We deployed a rescue team to somebody who'd fallen in a crevasse. A solo skier had fallen in a crevasse in a very difficult place to get to. It looked as if hours were slipping by, and I wanted to deploy another team to approach from another angle, and just pulled a lot of staff into our little ops room and said, I don't know all of your experience. Tell me what it is. Have any of you got enough experience on glaciers in the mountains to form a second rescue team? Which I really wanted to send, and I thought that might be the difference between this person surviving or not. And yet I couldn't put together another team without me being in it, and that wasn't my job to go. I needed to stay and coordinate. And we had a great result actually with the first team, who took I think about 6 or 7 hours to get to her, but the one who'd fallen in crevasse was okay. And we had a great result that day. But
Steve, you've definitely had your fair share of things going
that's
wrong.
Why I've gone
in
grey.
Very difficult environments. Can I ask? Does it get any easier with successive things going wrong? Have you felt more prepared with all that experience that you've accrued?
Yes, I think psychologically, the pressure of feeling that ultimately somebody's life or lives might depend on how you what you do in the next few hours or next day, is still a heavy responsibility. But I got used to it and didn't mind it, and to an extent liked being the tests of things going wrong a little bit. And I remember going and briefing one of our doctors at Union Glacier. I can't now remember what was going wrong. And she said to me afterwards, "You were so casual about it or so relaxed about it. I thought you were joking, or I assumed it was a training exercise." Because I said, this has happened. Please, can you go and gather your medical kit, get ready to get to load a Twin Otter and go in half an hour if we can. So when I became the operations manager, my perspective and role changed, and the fundamentals of as you said, whether it's first aid training or working in intensive care, but doing the basics well and doing the basics better than you've ever done them before is just as true. But the role changes from going and doing to planning and communicating what your plan is. And in management terms, you'd say the first role of the leader is to define the task. But when you're dealing with an emergency or incident response, obviously you don't need to do that. You've just got to decide how to use your resources and how many and when. And one of the, I think, parallels with the COVID situation with working in Antarctica is the long time frame. It takes a long time to get ready. You've got to get your personal protective gear sorted out. You're deploying a rescue team by air. They might have a 5 or 6 hour flight to get to the injured party out on their expedition in the wilds of deep field Antarctic operations. So the time frame is extended. You've got long working days. We used to joke we work till it gets dark. Obviously, there's 24 hours of daylight in the Antarctic summer, and so the tasks of the leader or a manager of communicating the plan, telling everybody what your vision is, checking that they're okay as things change, as other events take over and other delays or other problems evolve. You gain more information. You have to keep making sure everybody knows what the latest version of the plan is and keep seeing how that's going to evaluate as you go. And as I was saying about this one incident, with thinking, well, it's not going well enough. We're not going to get there in time. What else can I do? Can I get a second team deployed to come in from, in that instance, the other side of this crevasse field, which in the end we didn't have enough experienced people to. I wasn't willing to put them at risk, so we decided against doing that. But keeping people motivated, keeping people informed is vital. But you've also got to keep them fed and rested, and send some people to bed, because this is going to take all day, or all night, or 3 days, or however long it's going to take. And one of the first things to do is to think, right, well, what resources do I need in 18 hours time? Let's plan for that as well. And it's complicated and multifaceted, and therefore interesting and challenging, but equally rewarding when it goes well.
Steve, a lot of parallels at the moment are being drawn between this current pandemic and wartime Britain. It's perhaps the last time that, as a nation, we were facing something massive and unknown together. And you've got some thoughts about the Battle of Britain and some parallels that has with the current situation. Yeah, what was going on during the Battle of Britain?
Yes, okay, it's a great. We've all grown up with stories of a battle in Britain, and Winston Churchill's amazing line about the few, and never in the history of armed conflict had so much been owed by so many to so few. And because the Royal Air Force did so well in the Battle of Britain, it would be easy to think that the planning and the preparation for it had been really good, and some aspects of it were the development of radar and the integration of radar as an early warning system into the human eyeball, the observer corps, which has a network of observers spread across the country to report in by phone of what was actually going on overhead. And this amazing analog data processing network of sector of the RAF fighter command was divided into sectors. Each sector had a controlling station, and those fed and received information from headquarters. So when an attack came in, squadrons were deployed to go to the right place, hopefully at the right altitude. The altitude was the most difficult bit of information. We often got that wrong. To meet every incoming bomber raid. but parts of the planning were looking back now were astonishing. After the First World War, when the next generation of the fighter planes was being developed, the pilots wanted biplanes. The pilots, because they're very maneuverable, we get more lift. But the aircraft engineers and designers knew that was the future wasn't that way. So you had to overcome resistance with the pilots to build the monoplanes, the Spitfire and the Hurricane. And a few very clever engineers realized that you needed much more firepower. You needed more machine guns or better weapons to actually hit other modern aircraft and knock them out of the sky, particularly the bombers. And it was a huge fight with the Air Ministry to get enough machine guns built into the design of the Hurricane and Spitfire that they were actually effective. And if either of those two things had gone wrong in the aircraft development, the results would have been completely different. But the thing I find most interesting is the training of the pilots themselves, who were all very young men, and they were taught how to fly their aircraft, but they weren't taught how to fight in it. And the Air Ministry had this basically combat manual of manoeuvring that was disastrous, and yet that was the policy. And you were in a uniformed service. You were disobedient if you didn't comply with the methodology and the formation flying. And the RAF started the Battle of Britain with this 2 sections making a flight and 2 flights making a squadron, and the section was 3 aircraft that flew in something called a Vic, which is like a V formation, where was a leader, but the other 2 pilots had to fly in really close together, so they're completely concentrating on not hitting the lead aircraft. And every time they turned, they had to reduce power to stay in formation, which is the opposite of what you want to be doing in a air combat situation. You want maximum power on. And what's so interesting is that the German Air Force started some years back with the same basic operating procedures. Some of them went and fought in the Spanish Civil War, and they came back with having realized what worked on paper didn't work in reality. And they had 2 pairs in something called a swarm, which was basically a big line abreast. They had room to turn, they had room to maneuver, and they weren't doing this close formation flying. And when the Battle of Britain started, the German Air Force couldn't believe the Royal Air Force were flying in these stupid Vic formations, and they called, well, to translate the German, they called them lines of idiots. They were so easy to attack. And obviously the fighter command pilots who survived the first few encounters realized very quickly that everything that they'd been taught was wrong, and they needed to come up with some new procedures in order to survive. And then they needed to develop those into how to take the battle to the enemy and to win in aerial combat. And yet there was no mechanism for spreading that information out through the whole of the Royal Air Force. And so the squadrons who were very busy in the southeast over Sussex, Surrey, Kent, were learnt fast and were flying completely different tactics to those in the Air Ministry's manuals. And yet, when they were worn out and another squadron would be sent south to replace them, they arrived flying in their Vics, and the junior pilots were decimated. And it took a long time, throughout really until 1941, for the story to get out that we need to throw that manual away and learn again from everything we've learned so far. There's a cliche in military training that a plan never survives contact with the enemy, and the Battle of Britain's a great example where some aspects of planning were the best in the world. The command and control structure for deploying the squadrons was the best the world had ever seen, and it's been a model that's been used ever since. But the tactics of how to aerial combat were just a decade out of date at the start of the war.
Wow, and it's such a pivotal moment in our nation's history. Hitler was planning Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of mainland Britain, and air supremacy was the one thing that Britain had and had to maintain to prevent that. And I think the incredible thing there was the way that the pilots reinvented the rules of engagement. That they instead of flying in that V formation, there was enough kind of grassroots, bottom up innovation going on that they were able to find ways to fox the Luftwaffe, the German pilots enough to win those dogfights in the sky. And it's an incredible story. And I think in the NHS at the moment, we are kind of trying to figure things out as we go along. We are facing something also massive and unknown and incredibly threatening. And I'm seeing some incredible rewriting of the rule book by frontline clinicians at the moment, right the way through from intensive care through to general practice. For example, some of my colleagues are playing around with ventilating patients in prone positions. They're trying different methods of ventilatory support. In primary care, we're looking at lots of different ways of assessing severity of patients over the phone. And none of that is coming from the government. They are helpful. They are giving us advice, but it's an immense role in having to kind of think around the problem but then also to try and disseminate some of that learning so that it can then be shared with the rest of the community.
Yes, and lots of stuff which is known is being relearned or reapplied in this context. You know, put a patient onto their front and their oxygen sats might go up by 4 or 5%. And oh, well, why don't we do that normally? There's lots of good stuff.
It's amazing how these kind of
being innovated. And the challenge is to share. You probably, from a Battle of Britain context, you'll have 1 or 2 squadron leaders or flight commanders who've really got it, who've understood what's needed, but there wasn't a mechanism in that structure then to send that information out to the rest of the whole organization very quickly, and that's one of the big challenges.
I suppose that's one of the main one of the great things about this modern age is with globalization and the internet, we are able to disseminate that learning, but it's just finding the right platform and creating the right communities for that to happen.
Absolutely, and filtering out all the duff information and the
yes, there's a lot of rubbish out there, isn't there? Yeah,
as well, which is
absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Well, thanks, Steve. That's been a really interesting conversation. Is there anything else that you want to say to medics on the front line? Any advice that you would like to give them from your background in polar exploration and leadership?
I'm feeling extremely ill qualified to do that, other than to pass on my admiration and thanks to everybody involved in dealing and battling with COVID, and to just reiterate the in the old management model, if you've got a task, you've got a group and an individual, and all three need to be working well and in harmony and in balance for things to go well. So keep looking after your colleagues around you, and keep looking after yourself. We need you to keep working and remain effective, which means you looking after yourself and staying safe, that you can keep doing your job tomorrow.
And I think if Steve, if you can go out in an Antarctic storm to rescue 2 fallen climbers, then hopefully we can go out into the hospital ward with our masks and aprons on and do our bit too.
I hope so. Thank you. It's been great chatting to you. Thank you very much.
Likewise, Steve. If people want to connect with you, reach out to you, how can they do that?
I think the best way of contacting me for medics is probably through the World Extreme Medicine office.
Fantastic. Thanks for your time, Steve.
Great. Nice chatting to you. Thanks very much.